All right. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Now, Islamism casts a growing shadow over the UK. Both foreign and homegrown Islamist currents are fueling tension and challenging national stability. Islamist ideologies have taken deep root, disrupting communities and igniting fierce political debate inside the UK. Their political influence and impact are advancing at every level of society, and bold action is urgently needed, and drastic steps must be taken if disaster is to be avoided and this threat is to be turned back. How has Islamism reshaped British society? Can its spread be halted? And what must be done to restore unity, security, and social cohesion? Joining us today is Mr. Dominic Green. He is a historian and a columnist and a self-described recovering musician. And he writes regular columns for the Wall Street Journal, for the Spectator magazine, Standpoint magazine, and a number of other magazines. And he joins us this week to discuss the topic of Islamism in Britain. Now, of course, as we always do, we welcome your audience questions. And if you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A box located at the bottom of our screen to type your questions, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. With that, I will welcome Mr. Dominic Green. Dominic, how are you?
Hello, Enough. Thank you. And normally I would say that having been a musician earlier in my life was irrelevant to my, observations on the current political scene. But in this case, actually, it was quite useful because in the 1990s, it meant that I drove around and played in every single city in Britain. And that meant actually I quite early on, as it were, realized that a serious political social transformation was taking place because I went to the equivalent of what Americans would call flyover country.
Well, as we mentioned before, we will have to catch up on this at another time. The
Yes.
reason we began late today is because we got into it with music and our favorite bands. Now, anyway, thank you, Dominic, for joining us. Now, just to begin here, as I understand, you typically don't write on the issue of Islamism. You tend to write on culture and politics and foreign policy. So I'm very interested to get your take on this topic and how it pertains to the UK.
Thank you.
Now,
Yeah.
so just to
Like,
sort I'm sorry, go on.
no. Sorry.
Sure. So just to sort of start off here, can you give us sort of a general bird's eye overview of Islamism in the UK? Maybe how you would say it began, how it has evolved, and where it stands today?
Thank you. Well, as you were saying, I'm not a scholar of Islam, but if you're an observer of history and politics and so on in the present or the recent decades, then you do inevitably have to learn a great deal about the nature of immigration, assimilation, and the role of Islamist groups within that. These are just the facts on the ground of politics in Western European societies, and increasingly, of course, also in the United States. In 1950, there were no significant Muslim populations in any European country, with the possible exception of France, which, because of its colonial relationship with North Africa, probably had the first substantial Muslim populations, but it was relatively small. We're looking at something which started in the late 50s into the 1960s and was primarily done for economic reasons. It was believed that we needed more people, basically to do unskilled and semi-skilled work. This actually worked for a while and then turned out not to be true as heavy industries collapsed in Western Europe. And so by the 1970s, you had substantial populations of, say, mainly Turks in Germany, North African Muslims, obviously from the colonial territories of France, were in the major fringe cities. And in Britain, predominantly, we would say now Pakistanis, but of course Pakistan didn't exist until 1947. They were the children or grandchildren of the British Raj, which had encompassed modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And so these populations were concentrated in the industrial cities of the Midlands and Northern England, and of course in London as well. And in all of these cities, they settled in what had traditionally been the working class inner city, often rather shoddily built Victorian neighborhoods. In other words, they lived as poor people among poor people. And over time, it turned out that not only were the economic assumptions which had driven the pro-immigration policy of the 1950s and 60s unfounded, but it also turned out that the assumptions about assimilation, based on the very limited prior experience of Western European societies, was also untrue. And first, people thought this might just be to do with numbers. There were more people coming in a shorter period of time. And then they thought, well, maybe this is to do with economics because, there was unemployment and great economic turbulence in the 1980s and so on. And then they began to wonder, well, no, actually, perhaps they don't actually want to assimilate. And that, judging from what the opinion polls say, is a substantial factor. And then that brings us to, well, how does a community find political expression? And this is quite a complicated thing. Governments create communities very often. They need to negotiate with what they call community leaders. They often appoint them. The classic version of this is France, after the revolution, created a body for its Jews. So they had someone to talk to, and they could kind of run the community through that leadership. And indeed, the story in Britain and France in particular has been attempts to create those communities for Muslims, and it hasn't actually worked very well because the unwritten assumption is that this will eventually succeed in pulling the members of this community into the mainstream. And of course, what happens instead is the institutions become captured by radicals. And again, this is not unique to Muslims. This is a political situation that recurs. So we have a situation of a large number of people who don't assimilate very well, who themselves, when they're not being told by governments that they are a community, even though, say, they may come from Morocco, Iran, and Pakistan, and be completely different in language and in extraction. They may be Shia, they may be Sunni, they may be Ahmadis, there may be all kinds of things which should divide them. It's not just the government which is telling them, no, you're a member of the Muslim community, singular thing. It's also the radicals within the Muslim community. And amongst the radicals, I would count the vast majority of the religious leadership, who are very traditionally minded, over the decades received lots of funding from Saudi Arabia, for instance, a great mosque builder, and also expressed in the case of Pakistani Muslims and Muslims from India, the pre-existing radical tradition, which can be traced back to the middle of the 19th century. A lot of these groups are not post-colonial so much as colonial. And indeed, the story of colonial revolts against Britain and France cannot be written without looking at the origins of Islamism as we know it. So all of these historical chickens came home to roost. An immigration policy that failed, a pre-existing history of colonial era antagonism, and this is something we can't underestimate, I feel, the internal dynamics within what we would call the Islamic world. Because while the Western liberal societies have in recent decades been going through a period of confusion and a loss of energy and purpose, and even starting to talk of themselves as being post-liberal in somehow. While that has been going on, there's been a great surge of political and intellectual energy in the Islamic world. And a lot of it has just expressed itself in destructive politics, but that's not the only aspects of it, in fact. The Muslim world has gone through the demographic boom, which the Western liberal societies had in the 18th and 19th centuries. So that's an internal dynamic as well. And running alongside all of this is this long-standing question of whether the norm in international dealings is to be determined by Western liberalism and which our leaders like to talk of as the rules-based order and so on, or in fact whether there are rival systems which are capable of standing on their own. And in a world where we see multipolarity returning, Russia, China, these are now independent functioning powers. Well, why should not Islam function as one of those global forces? That's the argument. And if that is the case, then why should you integrate into a dying society when you are part of something which is far stronger, older, and more vibrant? Goes the argument. So this represents an unprecedented challenge to the assumptions and the nature of Western liberal societies. And I'll pause there.
Well, thank you. There's you touched on a lot that I did want to discuss here, and primarily among them is the issue of I guess integration and what it means to be British and what it means to be a Muslim in Britain. A major point of concern within the UK is the question of whether, with the mass influx of Muslims and Islam into Britain, there they're effectively forming what are parallel sorts of communities alongside mainstream British society. And with that, we are seeing things like parallel legal systems in which the Islamic Sharia is being kind of secretly and quietly implemented, and it signs off on practices like forced child marriages, genital mutilation, and things of the sort. How real is this threat, and how prevalent is it today in the UK?
Right. The first thing we must say is at the last census, which I believe was in 2021, people who described themselves as Muslims constituted 6% of the population. I was talking last week actually with a demographer who reckons it's higher, but still probably not yet into double figures. So we're looking at a surprisingly small part of the population, actually. Um, Integration has, in most respects, failed in some communities versus others. Pakistani Muslims have a very low rate of integration, and not accidentally, they have a very low rate of academic attainment. And the British state, in its effort to be accommodating and tolerant, has not enforced basic laws such as you can't pull your children out of school, you can't marry them off to their relatives back home, and so on and so on. So when we are talking about the failures of integration and the social pathologies, as they would be called if any other group was doing it, we are talking primarily about Pakistani Muslims. And as I said, Pakistani is used as a shorthand often to denote everybody from the Indian subcontinent and thereabouts. So we're primarily talking about that. And again, that's only a section of the 6%. The case which has brought global attention to something which had been going on for decades was, of course, the grooming and rape gangs in cities such as Rotherham in northern England and the Midlands, which is in fact a national phenomenon. This came to global attention because Elon Musk had tweeted it out. The police, as far as we now know, were aware of the phenomenon back in the 1980s. There were local attempts to get inquiries going, which police and these all, I'm afraid, took place in Labour Party controlled cities. The police and the political authorities did not want to know. The model of policing and government, really, which has been adopted in Britain, is called community relations and community policing. This means we live in a multicultural, multiracial society. Therefore, everyone must regulate their own affairs to the highest possible degree. And it's not for us to say if what they're doing is wrong. This is, funnily enough, an echo of imperial style policing. In India, the British did not treat the rather, put it this way, they had a liberal legal system and an illiberal conception of the individual and their rights. They related to their subjects by their religion. It was communal policing. And the same system is effectively used in Britain. You appoint a communal leader and they're meant to run things. And the result is, as you say, that all kinds of things which are illegal or the vast majority of people would consider un-British and would therefore want them to be made illegal if they started to happen. All of these things can then, prosper. And that's pretty much what's happened. And so, yes, it's not an exaggeration to say that if you go into many cities in the North and Midlands of England, or many parts of London or Manchester or Birmingham, that you are effectively in a parallel society. And the parallel society is not just composed of Muslims, it's composed of the millions of recent immigrants to Britain. Um, but I would say, yes, the tone in many ways in matters of social morality is set by radical Islam. And it's a well-known phenomenon that often immigrants are likely to cling more tightly to the values and habits of the old country than the people in the old country themselves. And that is another way in which they constitute a parallel society. And if you were to walk through these neighborhoods, and they are found in every major Western European city, you will notice famously the satellite dishes are all pointing southeast. They are all pointing towards Al Jazeera or points east of there. So the opportunity for radicalization, it's almost a perfect storm of exclusion, failure to assimilate, extremist attitudes that are not censored within a community because it feels itself to be excluded. Very hard for people to get out through the usual way of education and so on, particularly for girls. And the result is a community with catastrophically low levels of educational attainment, some of the worst levels of workforce participation, which is another way in which people assimilate just simply by going to work. By osmosis, you assimilate to society's norms. All of these things, it literally is every single box is ticked, and the result is, from the point of view of the government, well, they're terrified because effectively you've got a massive and growing population which you can't influence. And if you can't influence it, then how are you going to manage it? How are you going to govern it? Well, by compromise, actually, by giving it what you think it wants, particularly if a small number of its members are willing to conduct the most appalling terrorist atrocities, to make their feelings felt. And again, this goes for every single terrorist group and every single population that has supported them in history. Terrorists swim in the sea. A small number of people commit terrorist acts. A vast number may sympathize to a tiny degree even. But so it's a very hard nut to crack to get inside a community. The intelligence services in Britain, they've started talking about this, probably because I think they need more money, because the scale of it dwarfs anything that they've ever had to contend with. I mean, Britain famously had a problem with the Republican terrorism of the IRA. The Irish nationalists wanted Northern Ireland back, and they conducted a campaign of bombings against and shootings against civilians and so on. At the peak of its activity, the IRA was estimated to have between 300 and 500 fighters, people willing to actually take up a rifle or, train for that kind of thing. The security services in Britain, and that's internal and external services, the equivalent of the FBI and the CIA, say that they have about 40,000 people under active surveillance for Islamist activity. And that's active surveillance. In other words, people who are believed to be at work. The list of those who are believed to be potentially active or have been previously active and moved to the back burner, that's much, much larger. So this is, when people compare this to the IRA and Irish republicanism, they're getting it wrong for two reasons. One, the IRA had a political goal which could actually have been achieved by negotiation and may yet happen anyway, the return of the Republic to the Republic of Northern Ireland. That may happen. A lot of people on both sides of the aisle politically in Britain are quietly already reconciled to that. And as I said, the IRA was small enough that it could be easily surveilled and penetrated. This isn't the same at all. The Islamists wish to take over ultimately. They believe they have a mission and a mandate. And their numbers are so great that, as the leaders of the security services tell us, we can't keep tabs on all these people. And just to put that in perspective, that's 80% of the active cases that they can surveil. So all the other people who are considered a danger to public security, the far right, the racists, the animal rights people, just stop, oil, all the cranks and crazies and so on, are condensed into that other 20%. So that's an indication of the scale of the problem. And the scale is unprecedented. People in Britain, the government anyway, and the media like to say, we're a nation of immigrants. It's not really true. There was no significant immigration to Britain until after 1945. This accelerated after 1997 as a matter of policy. Both parties, Labour and Conservative, did this. And the result is, as I said, a problem whose scale is so great that it's uncontrollable. And the government, therefore, and I say government, I mean bureaucracy as well as elected leaders, the government figures the safest thing to do is effectively to comply, to surrender. And of course, when you surrender, you do to the loudest voices. So again, they're giving the extremists a chance to set the tone in this. So they're not helping the large number of people, large number of British Muslims who are, as we say, moderates, who may well be deeply sincere in their religious beliefs, but don't believe that they should attempt to alter the nature of British society, who don't think it's any of their business what the average English person does, whether they wish to drink and fornicate to their heart's content in the traditional manner. So this policy is not only endangering the safety of the vast majority of people in Britain, Muslim and non-Muslim, it's not actually helping with the crucial goal, which is, well, they're here. What are we going to do to assimilate people and get them to assimilate to the norm, the liberal norms of the other 94%? So it's a mess.
All right. Well, thank you. Again, you touched on a lot of things that I'm going to get to here shortly. Very quickly, we have a few audience questions that I would like to turn to. The first comes from Dr. Daniel Pipes, who says, "Thank you, Dominic, for an outstanding review. Why is the UK the only major European country not to have an important political party concerned with Islamism?"
Well, thank you, Dr. Pipes, and hello. The reason for that is that's the downside of having a two-party system, in that, as in the United States, the parties tend to converge around their function because they take turns and they basically merge into the bureaucracy. And Americans like to call this the uni party. And something similar happened in Britain. Because we have a first past the post system, it's very hard to launch a third party. It's been done. There is a Liberal Democrat Party. They're not very liberal and they're not very democratic, but they are there. And such is public outrage, really, at Islamist violence and intimidation and the failure of the immigration system and all of these things, that we do now have a right-wing party that has outflanked the Conservatives, the Reform UK party led by Nigel Farage, which, if there was an election tomorrow, would gain enormous traction and would become a major force. And that would make British politics more like the politics of Europe. We are also, funnily enough, in the same elections last year, we developed an independent Islamist party as well, which split off from the Labour Party. And that is also set to grow. So what we now have is a multi-party system being processed through the same old two-party system. So that is a major structural reason why it hasn't happened. But as I say, I think it is happening, and we're in a very dynamic period now of British history because the Brexit vote of 2016, Britain left the European Union, and even if they choose to do nothing, simply by setting that course, we will find things will change around us, things will change internally. And as I said, we're moving towards a more European type of politics. And if you look at Europe, what you have is the old centre-right party is only able to cling to power by striking a deal with what they call the new right parties, the nationalists and so on. And Britain is developing, I believe, a variation on that spin. it may happen that the new right and the old right, the conservatives and reform, merge, and we have a two-party system yet again. Because Labour are most definitely the party of British Muslims. They are the party of Islam. They are the party which put out the Prime Minister sent out greetings for the beginning of the Festival of Eid, which happened to fall on Mother's Day, and he didn't send out anything for Mother's Day. When it comes to cultural politics, the Labour Party is firmly on the side of a crucial demographic, which, as I said, is not. It's not 30% of the population, it's about 6% or so and rising. But this is the electoral strategy they have made, and indeed it's put them into power.
Thank you. Now, again, I want to touch on something you said there, but before that, you had brought up the point of British security and intelligence services and their very lax attitude towards a lot of this. Now, last week, David Shipley wrote a piece in The Spectator about how these nasty Islamist gangs are controlling the HMP Franklin, which is supposed to be the most secure prison in the UK, where we all well know a lot of this radicalization takes place. But I mean, even on top of that, with my own experience, I think the last time I visited London was maybe 2017. But I do remember specifically going into East London, probably for a lamb kebab or something. But I was shocked when I walked around and I saw a number of offices for Islamist institutions and organizations that are openly tied to terrorist organizations. How is
Mm.
all of this still allowed to operate? What are the British authorities doing?
Well, I'm afraid it's a combination of two things. One of them is the historical attitude and of Britain, because of its traditions of free speech and tolerance, being a place where people who had been chased out of their own countries could find safe harbor. Voltaire, before the French Revolution, fled to London because otherwise he was going to be beaten up and prosecuted. Um, the leaders of the post-colonial independence movements, most of them studied at Oxford, Cambridge, and the LSE. That's Gandhi and Nehru and all of the African leaders as well. So there is a positive tradition, as it were, in this sense. There's also a rather more cynical move, which is the British security establishment believes that it will punch above its weight, as Britain is always trying to do, by cultivating connections with radical groups and therefore not simply banning them. And the result is, for instance, I mean, I don't believe, for instance, the IRGC, the heart of the Iranian regime, the IRGC is not banned in Britain. And I don't believe it's just because the British are soft in the head or soft on terrorism, although they often demonstrate both of those things. I think actually it's an attempt to maintain connections and influence. And actually, to be honest, this also serves the United States, or so they tell themselves, in the sense that having Qatar as a deniable conduit to Hamas was actually an American policy. It wasn't just something the Israelis wanted, it was actually a US policy as well. So the result is that, as you're saying, extremist groups which would not be allowed to function in the Muslim majority states of the Middle East and beyond are able to operate openly in London. And there is a third factor, which is simple incompetence and not wanting to poke the hornet's nest. And therefore, street level phenomena such as radicalization in prisons, is simply ignored. Again, the truth is, governments are perfectly prepared to have one gang of thugs running a prison, and they don't really care whether it's a drug gang or a gang of Islamists. They just want the prison to be quiet, especially in a country where the prisons are so full, as Britain's are at the moment, and they're not building any more. So the result is a case, say, Tommy Robinson, the anti-immigration activist, who is sentenced and he's in prison at the moment for contempt of court for revealing the details of the accused in one of these rape and grooming gang trials. And in fact, the person whose details he revealed is also in prison at the moment. Now, Tommy Robinson is in solitary confinement. Not as a punishment, not because he smashed up his cell or anything like that. He's been placed in solitary confinement because the prison authorities cannot guarantee his survival under any other circumstances. So, in other words, his human rights are no doubt, whatever else he's been convicted of, they are being infringed upon because the prisons have a substantial Islamist gang presence. And this is a case, as I was describing, of when something which was just allowed to drift in that kind of laissez-faire way suddenly becomes a serious problem that requires serious action, and nobody is quite sure what to do or dares to start doing it.
Thank you. Lots to unpack in there as well. Now, typically we would be reaching the end of our conversation, but if I may ask, I don't want to take up too much of your time here.
Please go on.
Yeah, we have plenty of wonderful questions I'd like to get you, and
Oh,
this is a fascinating topic here. Thank you. So, continuing on here, something you mentioned earlier, we have a few questions addressing this, so I'm going to do my best to put them all into one. Something you mentioned earlier is about how these Islamist organizations are interacting with other organizations. Now, I know how this plays out in the United States, especially in a progressive city like my own, which is Denver, Colorado. But in the UK, a much more internationalist city, how is the progressive woke left-wing movement, which might include academics, activists, MPs, etc., what are they doing to effectively empower these Islamist organizations?
right. That's a very good question. I think the easy way to break it down is to break it into the soft and hard forms. The soft form is the one that I've described, which is how to manage an increasingly complex society with a substantial number of people who clearly don't feel an urge to conform to the norms of the majority. That's the soft placating of them. And that leads to the alteration of customs and the public space and so on. We're very familiar with that kind of thing. And again, it's not so unusual. I mean, it happens. It's not unique to Islam. It happens everywhere where a substantial group arrives who are unwilling or slow to integrate. That's what happens. The hard forms are more specific, and that is the what's been called the fusion of a dying ideology, the socialist revolution, which, let's face it, is an antique now, and a rising ideology, which is Islamism. And the crossover point, of course, is the Iranian Revolution, I would say. It's the last time anyone could seriously claim a revolution in the Islamic world fitted the pattern of Marxist revolutions. And the first time it was quite clear that we were in a new era. So the left, in its hard form, sees Islamism as the equivalent of a blood transfusion. And it has, of course, had a great revival on the back of it. Unquestionably, the radical left has revived itself by mobilizing the numbers of European Muslims. The soft form encourages the hard form, and the hard form bullies the soft form. So the result is suddenly the public baths, which are funded from everybody's taxes, have women-only days. And these are not described as accommodating the conservative Muslim sensibilities. They're often depicted as a triumph of feminism. If you were to look at the publicity materials, they'll probably show someone in a wheelchair. In other words, the multiculturalism of the society is being furthered. Of course, what's actually happening is the opposite of that. One set of norms, the monoculture of Old England, is gradually being replaced by another monoculture, which is the monoculture of international Islamism, which seeks, thanks to the internet in particular, has the means to start imposing the same standards on public life all over the place. And again, this, in the Orwellian times in which we live, this is described as being diversity and multicultural, and not. It's not actually. It's monoculture versus monoculture. There is a political monoculture we call Islamism. There is the monoculture of practice that we would call Islam. That is what is effectively being pushed into public spaces. And the progressives, as we would call them in the US, or the hard left, or the radical left, as we would call them, or basically the hard socialists in Europe, have absolutely They have made a long-standing alliance, and it's a very good question of who ultimately will be the senior partner. And I believe that the Labour government in Britain now demonstrates, in fact, that the Muslims are becoming the senior partner in it. Not because they necessarily have the numbers, but because the Labour Party depends upon their votes, and because they're willing to push for it. And it's a simple matter that the political language of Western liberal states, especially in Europe, it's very polite. You can't demand things. You can't say, if I don't get what I want, there could be trouble. But that is pretty much the line which is perfectly tolerable in most other places in the world, as far as I can understand. And just as the old hard left has imported the language of resistance, which is a term which was circulated in Arabic for decades before it became a thing in the US or Europe, well, just as it's done that, it's become susceptible to the hard language and the intimidatory tactics of Islamists. Because that kind of thing is just not done usually in the high consensus politics that Western liberals are used to. So they're staggered. They don't know what to say. So they are therefore willing to be bullied and to conform. And we see our Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who at one point was famous for wearing skirts that showed off her legs and so on. And it was a big running joke in the British Parliament, even. Adopting modest clothing in order to solicit the votes of her Muslim constituents and telling them that, yes, Gaza is at the forefront of her commitment. Meanwhile, in Birmingham, the trash men are on strike, and there are, mountains of uncleared rubbish and a serious rodent infestation. But that's not what the Labour Party is talking about. The Labour Party is talking about justice for the Palestinians in order to maintain an electoral coalition. And that's an example of how, the soft panders to the hard and the hard pushes the soft. And the next thing you have the mainstreaming of a politics, which, as I said, actually involves a small number of people and an even smaller number of activists.
Thank you. Now, turning again to the audience here. My colleague Dexter Van Zyl would like to ask, does Islamism in the West qualify as a form of settler colonialism?
Well, if you admit that settler colonialism is a thing, and as a historian, I would say yes and no, because everybody has always moved and settled, and the idea that it is an ideology is ridiculous. Um, Yes. But as I said, I don't believe that it's a sensible way of understanding most things. What you have, I think, is the normal movements of human populations sped up to warp speed by modern communications. The invention of jet travel probably did more to create the Islamist problem in Western societies than anything else. You have that, and you have digital communications, which means you can live on one side of the world while staying psychologically entirely back home, or even in an extreme version of back home, because everybody knows that what you see online isn't real. All of those things, I think, are much more the keys to this dynamic. And so you have a large population which can move with its attitudes intact or even enhanced over 2 or 3 generations. Uh, Political competition is about resources, competing for resources and power and so on, not necessarily colonizing things for resources. I think it's very different.
No, I completely agree. But
He's
I,
messing with us. Yeah.
no, I think you're correct there. Going back to something you mentioned earlier about the sort of discrepancy between how many Muslims, particularly on this Indian subcontinent, interact with their societies when they are in their homelands versus when they come to the West. Something that I tend to notice is that while they're in India or Bangladesh or Pakistan, they are, becoming doctors and engineers and pharmacists. And when they come to the West, the United Kingdom and Europe and the United States, as you mentioned, they become a lot more radical than they might have in their home countries. Their academic rates tend to be lower than they were if they were in their home countries, pursuing their studies there. What do you think accounts for that phenomenon?
Well, I think in that much, if very little else, they are actually assimilating because, you know, being an engineer or a doctor is the great red flag for extremist and terrorist activity, incidentally. The people who are most likely, as you know, to partake in this are the most qualified and the least qualified. Um, and this is a familiar Western pattern. It's in the 1890s. Joseph Conrad wrote a novel, The Secret Agent, which is about exactly this. The kind of and before that, the French revolutionaries were frustrated members of the professional class. And the same goes also in the Russian Revolution. Nothing makes you more of a nihilist than resentment and frustration about not getting on and not getting up. So, in that much, in this pattern of highly qualified, highly trained people turning into extremists and terrorists, that actually does fit the pattern of Western revolutionary activity. Um, and maybe, as I said, the presence of an ongoing indigenous Western left-wing revolutionary tradition perhaps feeds into that, because the one place that tradition survives is in the universities. So apart from giving you a credential as an electrical engineer, you might also absorb the philosophy of Karl Marx while you're at it.
Yeah, and as you say, we see that increasingly and ever increasingly in the West here. I am going to go to a question here from Andrew Rosemarine, a British barrister and Middle East expert and longtime viewer of our podcast. He asks, the best way to combat militant Islamism is through Muslim media. When Muslims are shown the barbarous murders perpetrated by groups such as Al Qaeda and Hamas on their own, moderate Muslims turn against them. Do you agree?
I would certainly agree that encouraging a wider access to accurate information is crucial to this. If you have a large number of young people in particular who are not exposed to the full range of information and not aware of the full consequences of extremist actions, then absolutely it's vital. But I would also look into banning certain media outlets from operating in these liberal societies. It's been done before. In When the IRA was active, the British government banned IRA spokesmen from speaking directly or being depicted on the news, and an actor would read out their words, or they would be shown only in silhouette. And people laughed, but the point was this stigmatized them. It said, if you conduct yourself in a certain manner, you lose the privileges of expression that are granted to everybody else. In other words, there is such a thing as a contract and laws, and if you break them, you lose the privileges that come with it. Therefore, banning something like Al Jazeera, for instance, or banning the far more extreme channels which are broadcasting hateful messages from overseas into people's homes and computers in Britain, banning those things is absolutely a positive thing. And as we know, there are plenty of intimidated and silenced voices which don't get the same kind of audience and the same kind of financial support. And there is such a thing, I believe, on many of these questions as a silent majority among British Muslims, as there are on many political issues. I think that plenty of people, they may have attitudes which are out of step when it comes to social and sexual morality with the majority of people in Britain. They do not necessarily constitute a security risk, however. They may actually just be living pious lives and that's that, and pay their taxes and all the rest of it. Those people need to be supported, and anything which increases the range of options which is available to Muslims in Britain or in anywhere else in the Western world is undoubtedly a good thing. Because at the moment, the media to which they're being exposed demonstrably is funneling people towards radicalism or not disturbing assumptions which otherwise should be disturbed.
All right, thank you. Now, uh, hopefully, I'm not taking too much of your time here, so we can maybe end
Go
on this
on, do.
question. But for going back to a more kind of all-encompassing view and a sort of prospect for what the future might look like. 3 days ago, maybe 4 days ago, Tim Stanley wrote a column in the Telegraph that he believes that Britain is lurching towards a civil war and nobody knows how to stop it. Do you agree with this sentiment? And do you think most people in Britain agree with this sentiment?
I think he's correct. I would use the term civil conflict. When we say civil war, we assume something like, say, the breakdown of Yugoslavia, where two different groups are able to, get control of different elements of the military and military equipment. That's not what we're seeing here. What we already have is a low-level civil conflict involving territorialism, gang violence, and a vast amount of violence and hostility, which simply goes beneath the radar of the police. We have a situation where the police and the government are now seeing their role not as policing the law breaking of the terrorists or Islamists, but as controlling the reactions of the majority. The majority have finally, after decades of a rising list of crimes and appalling terrorist acts, finally seem to have lost their patience. And the result is, of course, the other 94% of the country are going to be far harder to manage than 6%. So, yes, I believe we are in the early stages of what could be a serious civil conflict. And this will take the form, I believe, of people being driven out of certain areas and informally becoming they will be run according to local custom, shall we say, not by the law of the land. This is a process which has actually been encouraged by the Labour Party in particular. What happens is a very good question because, if we were to continue on the present path of an unselective high immigration model with no serious change in policing, assimilation policy, and so on, then yes, we're heading towards catastrophe. And the same goes for France, Germany, Scandinavia. All of these countries, we see this playing out. That said, we don't necessarily have to have a catastrophe. It would require a substantial redirection of resources away from a welfare state to an interventionist policing state, or at least one that made the law of the land actually real as the law that people live by. We are seeing a redirection of resources in Europe towards NATO, away from welfare. And perhaps the domestic equivalent of that is actually required. We're in a different era. I don't hold out too much hope for it happening, but I do believe that now it has become acceptable to talk about these things in public in Britain for the first time in decades. And the fact is, much as I respect him, Stanley, I don't believe he would have written this 5 years ago, even though none of the data has very much changed. It is now acceptable to say in a broadsheet newspaper the simple truth that British society is breaking down because of the path we've been on. And this is no different to the blue state society in the United States. Actually, I haven't lived there for 20 years. I don't see too much difference. No different to what's happening in France and Germany. So there's nothing unique about Britain, and it is absolutely breaking down. And I do believe that the current path will lead to uncontrollable violence between Muslim groups who have already formed their own kind of paramilitary groups. We saw in the riots in the summer of 2024, large numbers of Muslim men rallying, carrying weapons, being told on film by a policeman, don't bring the weapons to the march, put them back in the mosque. That's not sustainable in a liberal society. So it might be tolerable in an illiberal society, but who wants to live in that? And we have also seen the signs of the white English organizing as well, and talking in these terms of the need for paramilitary preparation. And so another Irish writer, Iris Racinos, has described the next phase as comparable to Northern Ireland during the Troubles, where there was territorialism, criminal groups funded by gang activity, massive terrorism, a policing policy which involved suspending the normal rights that people would have under arrest, all of those things. And I think we're actually into that now in those early stages. And unless there is a sudden and drastic change in policy, it's going to get much, much worse.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
And on that good news.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say I just lied to you a moment ago. There is one question that came
Oh,
in
good.
from
Go
an
on.
anonymous attendee here. It's totally unrelated, but before we began, we were on the subject of your bio and your Wikipedia page. An anonymous attendee would like to say first, thanks very much for an informative and enlightening presentation regarding the discourse about Islamism. And they go on to say, an unrelated question. I saw an article recently about individuals named Dominic Green. Are you the landsman, Dominic Green?
Um, I wrote an article about how there were several people called Dominic Green, including the villain of a James Bond film, and I'm not him. I tell you that much. I wouldn't be having this conversation now. I'd be living in my villain's lair inside a mountain or something. And I'm not the science fiction writer of that name. Um, so no, I am. That makes me the landsman, Dominic Green. Absolutely, yeah. With all
Well,
respect to the others, yeah.
maybe except the Bond villain. But Dominic,
No,
thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for going past our normal allotted time. We still have something like 40 questions in the queue
go
here.
on. Ask some more if you
I,
like.
if if you've got the time,
I do. I do actually.
maybe we
Yes,
can go
yes.
for a full just to the hour here, and
Yeah,
then
of course. I'll try and be quick. I mean, aware that I've been rambling. It's a very interesting and complicated subject, and I've been trying to be concise, but it is actually, it's a big one, and so,
sure, yeah.
but
Um,
I'll try and keep it snappy. But please, let's have more questions.
well, thank you with your grace there. I'll go to a question then from Lokman Kurdistani, an MEF fellow, who asks, what are your predictions for the UK in 10 years? Will the UK government implement any measures to address the spread of Islamism across the country, or have any actions already been taken?
Um, The No actions have been taken in recent years, at least not publicly. The effort to contain Islamism and view it as a security issue, i.e., manage the most extreme cases, people who want to commit acts of terrorism, has allowed all the other manifestations of Islamism to be seen as normal and therefore to prosper. The result is that sympathy with Islamist goals is embedded in the governing system, even in the courts, certainly in the parliament. All of this will have to be rooted out. You can vote out the bums in the parliament, and I think most of them will be actually on precisely this issue and the related issue of immigration. Changing the bureaucracy is very difficult. We have come to talk recently of things like the administrative state and even the deep state. Changing a bureaucracy is the hardest thing of all because that is actually the operating system of a state, not the elected leaders, the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy has made its deal, as it were, with Islamism. The civil service in Britain is reconciled to this, apparently. So changing it's going to be hard. I have days on which I believe it'll never happen, and I also have days on which I believe that in 10 years' time we will be looking at a very different reality. Um, every single person that I have spoken to in Britain, often quite randomly, and I try in the way of writers to talk to as many random people as possible rather than just people who confirm what I think, I've been very surprised by the willingness of people to discuss these things openly, which previously was just considered unacceptable, and also by the degree of anger at the elected leadership and the bureaucracy. And so I would not, therefore, write off Britain. I would say that we have been in tighter corners before, put it that way. There have been harder times in Britain, and people have actually reacted and come through very strongly. And I think you're about to be surprised, actually, by the strength of the public reaction, which is only now just beginning. And the fact that the Labour government calls it far right whenever anybody objects to acts of terrorism or failures of immigration and assimilation shows how out of touch the political establishment is and what a shock they're going to be in for. I think there's going to be a massive, massive public reaction against all of this. And it's going to, with a bit of luck, change the nature of our governments and change their assumptions about what their responsibilities are.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question here from Professor Asher J. Matathias. For a long period, it was thought that the influx of Muslims from totalitarian states in Europe would have the welcome effect of gaining tolerance. My question focuses on their origin. do their societies have to undergo their own Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment before the halcyon of peaceful coexistence takes effect?
This is a very this is a big question, and I'll try and be quick with it. A lot of our assumptions about the nature of progress are depend upon the Western experience and in particular, the experience of liberalization for Christianity. The idea of progress is the secular version, after all, of Christianity, and liberalism has always positioned itself as the successor to Christianity. Nowhere is it written that the liberalization has to occur at all in, say, Chinese society or under Islam. It's simply not. It doesn't have to be like that. The assumption that this was the path everyone was on was easy to believe in when the Western economies had the lion's share of the global economy and set the rules. But we're in an era where that no longer is the case. If, therefore, we are in a multipolar world of multiple civilizations, which I believe is where we are, the question then becomes, well, what are the conditions that we wish to live under in our civilization? The mission to redeem the world is over for the Western states. They can't afford it, and the public don't want it. Therefore, how are they going to fix their own societies? And as I said, this requires us to rethink very basic questions about how we wish to live, what are the values we live by, what is the purposes of our governments. The rest of it, there's a limit to what we can do. We have seen disastrous interventionist wars, which the American public rightly identifies as having failed to deliver both democracy or stability, and have in fact, rather than exporting democracy, have led to the import of populations who have had the most radicalizing experience of all, which is war. A war brought upon them by Western liberalism, in fact. So we need to really deeply reconsider the purposes of our societies, fix our societies, and focus on those questions. I would love it if there was a reform movement, within Islam. I would love it if people became comfortable and wealthy and happy rather than uncomfortable, poor and angry. These are always positive things for everybody. I do believe, however, that has to come from within the societies. That you can't do it by force or even bribery. It's got to come from within. And meanwhile, we have more than enough to be getting on with on our own doorsteps.
Thank you. And of course, I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. Now, for real this time, we have
Ah,
unfortunately reached the end of this week's podcast. And I would like to thank you again, Dominic. This has been fantastic. It's always great to hear insights on these things from the other side of the pond.
Anna, thank you. And also thank you to all the questions.
Of course. Now, apologies if I did not get to your questions here. For those of you who were asking in the Q&A if this broadcast will be recorded, yes, it will be recorded. We hope to have it posted to our YouTube channel either tonight or tomorrow morning. So you can watch it there. We'll be emailing it out. We'll be posting it on our socials in case you didn't get to watch the entire length of this. Now, Dominic, for our viewers and listeners, is there somewhere that you would suggest if they would like to follow more of your work?
I write regularly for the Wall Street Journal, and I also do a weekly column for the Washington Examiner. And sometimes I do a feature there, often on European politics, and frequently, therefore, upon Islamism and related issues.
All right. Thank you very much. For those of you watching on YouTube, I will be sure to link Mr. Green's Twitter handle in the video description below. For our viewers and listeners, please be sure to join us Wednesday for our Israel Insider podcast with Ashley Perry. As always, we appreciate your viewership and your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.